Welcome to this episode of the B2B Marketers on the Mission podcast, and I'm your host, Christian Klepp. Today, I'll be talking to Dan Balcauski. He's the founder and chief pricing officer of product Tranquility, who helps high-volume B2B SaaS CEOs define pricing and packaging for new products. His approach emphasizes understanding customer segments and measuring value in ways that drive long-term growth. Tune in to find out more about what this B2B Marketers mission is. All right, Dan Balcauski, welcome to the show, sir.
Good to be here, Christian. Thank you for having me.
Great to be connected, Dan, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation because this is going to be a first for this show. We've never had anybody on to talk about this topic. Nonetheless, it is very relevant and very pertinent for B2B marketers. So let's dive in, shall we?
Let's do it. Hopefully I can clear the high bar you've set already for your listeners.
No pressure whatsoever. None. All right. Okay, so Dan, you're on a mission to, I think what you called it was help dispel B2B SaaS pricing illusions, right? So for this conversation, let's focus on the topic of how to leverage customer segmentation in pricing for B2B. So I'm going to kick off the conversation with this question. Why is segmenting your audience crucial for setting prices that reflect true value and maximize revenue?
Well, I'm really excited to dive into this topic, and I'm going to actually probably do a faux pas right off the bat, which is I'm going to ask the host a question to his question.
Ooh.
So, Christian, what should a beer cost?
Where is it brewed? Is it imported? Is it local? Ingredients? Alcohol content? I don't know. Maybe $1.
Maybe $1.
Okay. I'm hoping it's $1.
Okay. So, Christian, you just articulated several different, what we call attributes of that product. What type of beer is it? Where is it brewed? What's the alcohol content? Things you didn't comment on. Is that beer in the grocery store? Are you at a bar or nightclub? Are you at a sporting event or a concert? That same beer that might cost you $1, you'd be happy to pay $1 in the grocery store. You're at your sporting event, they're going to charge you $20. I don't know what the Canadian US conversion is this day, so I'll stay in the US denomination. I think it's about parity last time I checked, but nonetheless, that context is incredibly different. You know, I've asked this question before and people are like, well, I don't know. I don't drink beer. I'm not a beer drinker. So they're a non-market participant. So I think it's interesting because where your head went to is incredibly common when we're working with technical teams, technical founders, building software products. Hey, why is your product better? Well, we have feature A, B, and C, and our competitors don't have. They don't have those, or they have X, Y, Z, but they aren't as good as ours. Value, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. It's only exists in the consciousness of men, and it's contextual and relative to everything else. When you're at the ball game, and the guy's selling you that beer for $20, you may not be happy. But what are your alternatives? For you may be in a celebratory mood. Oh, okay, whatever. I knew kind of getting into this. But there's also very legitimate, what we might term price fences. There's security at the front, patting you down, making sure you didn't bring in your own alcohol. The cruise lines know this extensively. Heavy screening on your luggage because the cruise ship ticket, relatively cheap, almost no margin. They make all their margin on alcohol. So they want to make sure that you're buying what they have on ship at a captive audience. And we could play this. It's not just alcohol. We could play this game with any commodity. You're walking down the street and you stop. It's a hot day. You pop in a gas station, buy a bottle of water. I guarantee you your valuation and how much you'd pay for that bottle of water would be very different if you were wandering in the Sahara Desert for 7 days. What does all this have to do with the topic that you hinted at the beginning? Is that customer segmentation is important to pricing because the value rests in the eye of the consumers. And what we do with customer segmentation is we try to create relatively homogeneous subgroups of customers that have similar needs or are in similar contexts. And that way we can create offers, create products, and price them to meet the needs of those specific customers.
Wow. You went really deep, really fast. And all of that from, man, I just wanted a beer. Like, but you brought up something earlier in the conversation, Dan, and that was a great segue to the next question, because you and I both know the word value gets thrown around these days, and there may or may not be any context. But I know in your world and in your area of expertise, there is context to it, and I'd like to get into that a little bit deeper here. So let's talk about value, and what are some of the different ways to think about value concerning pricing, I think, is one part of the question. And the second question is, why is a clear definition of value essential for successful pricing strategies? And you hinted at it earlier.
Well, I'll answer the second question first, because I think it's simpler and helps ground the first part. I imagine at some point, many of your listeners took some sort of Econ 101 course where they were introduced to this thing called a demand curve. You know, supply curve, demand curve, they intersect. Where they intersect is a market, what they call the market clearing price. Those are great tools for economists. And yes, price does have a relationship to volume. But, you know, unless you're probably the professor teaching that every day, a detail that you probably have faded with the sands of time is that those curves often depend upon a very specific market context. What you tend to get taught in your Econ 101 classes are two very specific and rare market situations. The situation of the pure commodity, I'm selling pork bellies, steel, gold, or the pure monopoly, I'm the only provider of a good in a market. The rest of us live in this messy middle. And I think most of our econ teachers just didn't have enough time in the semester to go over what happens when you're living in that messy middle. But unfortunately, most of us work at companies that are not on those extreme ends. Probably for the good, because it's really hard to be on either of those ends. And, you know, the government tends to go after you if you're a monopoly. It might seem like a good thing. And if you're a pure commodity business, it's hard to be a go-to-market leader because you've got a real tough job on your hands. The other foundational relationship besides volume that pricing has is to value. And so it's one of these areas that folks, we really need to understand what that means in order to do a rigorous pricing well. And especially as we're developing innovative products, because value clarification is a really crucial lever. Again, going back to the technical teams who are building products, we tend to talk in feature language, but put yourself on the other side of that table on a demo call. Oh, we've got feature A, B, and C, and you're leaving it as a, remember those old textbooks where they say, we leave this as an exercise to the reader to figure out. You have left as an exercise to the reader what feature A means in the life of your customer. And so not only in pricing, but also in being able to properly describe how we're going to make an impact in a customer's life, value clarification is the most, has the largest room for improvement. So as you mentioned before, value tends to be really over abused, vaguely defined, probably just as much, if not more than customer segmentation, I find. I rest on the shoulders of giants. I use a couple of frameworks that really help to make this specific. So I'll just name them quickly and then we'll kind of elaborate them a little bit more. So the first is what's called the value cascade. It was elaborated, as far as I could tell, first by a gentleman named Tom Nagel, who wrote what might be considered the Bible of pricing, the strategy and tactics of pricing. If you're really, really into this topic, it's kind of a must for anyone who's serious about this topic. It's a little bit dense, but he outlines this concept called the value cascade. And then I use a lot of Jobs to be Done, which has many fathers. Theodore Levitt, famous Harvard Business School professor back in the day, Clayton Christensen, Bob Mesta, Tony Olwick, many people have contributed to the evolution of jobs to be done. And both of these come together to really give a crisp understanding of value. So the first part of the value cascade. So why is it called the value cascade? Tom Nagel, he drew a diagram. Sorry, this is not a visual medium, but I'll try to briefly describe it. If we think of it, what is a cascade? Cascade is another word for waterfall. So if we think of a series of bar charts where each bar proceeding from left to right is shorter than the one next to it, in order you have use value, exchange value, perceived value, and then customer willingness to pay, and eventually price. So it really helps us understand how we get from understandings of value and tying it to price. So the first part of that is what's called use value. So this is where something like jobs to be done is super helpful, because use value is really the sum of all benefits a customer could potentially receive from a product. Economists might use a term like utility. Within the frameworks of jobs to be done, we tend to focus, especially a lot in the B2B world, around what jobs to be done might call functional jobs. Helps me make more money, save money, decrease risk, save time, those type of things. Why do I love jobs to be done, though, is because jobs to be done helps remind us that functional jobs aren't the only type of value we get. We also have emotional jobs, which jobs theory breaks into both personal and social jobs. So what would be a personal job? Personal emotional job is help me increase my status, help me increase my confidence. We see this all the time. A Rolex and a Timex have the same functional equivalent. They both tell you exactly what time it is. Why do people pay $20,000 for a Rolex and $20 for a Timex? Because they're paying for status and emotional value, right? Social value, very useful if we're working for the government or NGO. So, we're humans, we're social creatures by nature. We don't do things only for our own good, thank God. So we would have things like increasing access to education or healthcare or voting rights, right? Things like this. So those would be social benefits. So that's kind of where the economists lay, right? It's like, okay, what are all the benefits that someone would get out of this? But we don't live in that pure world, because especially when it comes to pricing. Like use value is almost never relevant in a pricing exercise because there's always some option, some status quo. We live in a market environment. Again, assuming you're not in a monopoly situation. So Tom introduces this idea of exchange value. So exchange value is, okay, I have some reference value. I'm getting some job done, and then I'm positively or negatively differentiated from that other option. So example I like to use would be, imagine our good friend Elon Musk is he's swapped place with Tom Hanks on the Castaway Island, and he's stranded there for years. And he finally sees in the distance a ship coming. Ship captain arrives on shore, says, "Elon, I'm here to take you to shore." The use value for Elon is tremendous, right? It doesn't matter that he's got $500 billion in the bank. All of that is useless to him. Like getting back to civilization should be the only thing that matters. So his economic cost is equal to his use value. He should be willing to say, I will give you, let's leave the ethics of the situation aside a bit. I'd be willing to give you all my money and borrow from all my friends for whatever you want to get me off this island. But then while they're having this discussion, ship captain B shows up. It's Elon's lucky day. He hasn't had anyone for years, and two show up at once. The ship captain says, "Hey, Elon, you don't need to pay him your entire fortune. You only need to pay me $1 million." So now we have a new market price. So now ship captain A has a decision, right? He could bow out and say, well, okay, I couldn't get 500 billion. I can only, now there's a market price. Or now you start creating this situation where ship captain A says, Elon, I'll do it for, $1.5 million, but you can sleep in my captain's quarters, and I have a band on deck, and we'll entertain you, and we have free flowing alcohol, whatever you want. And so now they're talking about differentiated value, and this is the area we most live in. But it doesn't stop there with this value cascade. So that's the transition from use value to exchange value. Because even though we do this all the time as marketers, we say, hey, our widget is so much better than what you're doing today. I've got a spreadsheet that proves it. If you're pumping out this many widgets in your factory per hour, we've got case studies, et cetera, that prove that we could increase the amount of revenue in your factory will generate for your company by 50%. That only matters to the extent that your buyer understands that value and believes that value. And so this is where the next level comes in, which is customer perceived value. Why does this matter? Because humans are not spreadsheets. It's a very messy economic world. Rarely do we have just a choice between two options, two ship captains trying to outline just between two things. Anytime you've gone to buy a complex piece of B2B hardware or software, what do? You ask a couple friends for, hey, what have you used at your companies? You go to G2 or Trust Radius or one of these review sites. You get a kind of short list of candidates. You go to their websites. You look at logo gardens, which, hey, this is used by Samsung or Disney or JP Morgan. Oh, okay. Does everyone go to the pricing page and look at all 300 features, if that's even available, publicly listed? And if they could they even understand what they were looking at? No, because we only can have time for so much, where most people are what economists would call satisficers, not maximizers. Like, we're not going to the finest detail in every single piece. And so, again, this idea of value only exists in the consciousness of men. And therefore, and I guess you be politically correct using it for mankind, we have a lot of work as marketers to increase the perceived value of our product. That's why we use things like customer testimonials, case studies, logo gardens, etc. So, and perceived value is finally what drives customer willingness to pay. So that's how those things tie together.
Yeah, no, thanks for unpacking that, because I kind of knew that this wasn't going to be a very straightforward answer, right? You'd kind of have to get into the weeds of it, right? I did have one follow-up question before we move on. And do you feel that, from your experience with the folks that you've worked with, you feel that perhaps their lack of understanding of this value cascade leads them to do things where they just default to, well, they compete on price, which then means they're competing with features instead of actually understanding, to your point, how their product or their solution delivers value to the customers?
It constantly boggles my mind how common it is for companies to not understand the value they provide to their customers. I wish I had a bulletproof explanation for this, because I am not the first and only person to say, talk to your customers, figure out their world, where you fit into it, why people made a choice. So I would say too often, I have talked to CMOs, VPs of marketing in charge of very important large B2B software companies who say, we have no differentiation. And I'm sorry, that is a cop-out. If the brand manager of Avion can charge a 3x price premium over Dasani, which is charging a 10,000x price premium over, in the US, what is almost perfectly suitable substitute coming out of your tap, you as a B2B software person cannot say we have no differentiation. You just have not thought deep enough about why customers choose you. It's even more extreme because in many situations, especially as you get into higher dollar value B2B goods, you don't just usually have one person making the decision. You've got one person who maybe the vendor is interacting with, but then they've got to turn around and make a justification to the CTO or maybe the CEO and the CFO, right? Why are we going? Oh, we're buying a CRM. Why didn't you guys just go with Salesforce? Well, we went with this other company because XYZ. So if you're CRM VP of marketing and you're like, we have no differentiation, but they bought you, like, at some point your end buyers had to go have that conversation. It just reflects that you haven't done your due diligence to go do that. And therefore it creates a lot of confusion for the rest of the go-to-market organization, because you're then sort of left guessing and guiding everyone in terms of what should we put first? How do we talk about what we do, why we're better? So yes, I agree. Lack of this understanding is incredibly prolific, and I think it leads to a lot of dysfunction down the line.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. I'm going to move us on to the next question about, on the topic of leveraging customer segmentation and pricing for B2B, what are some of the key pitfalls to avoid, and what should be done instead?
So there's a couple of different pitfalls that I would highlight. So the first is maybe the most extreme, And probably your audience of marketers don't run into this themselves much, but they may run into it from the C-suite executives that they have to talk to, which is we don't, this idea of customer segmentation can be anathema within an organization. All our customers are the same. If you are in an organization where your C-suite talks like that, I might leave that organization. Might be my point of view, because you're going to have a really hard time doing anything well. What you're probably going to have to do a lot, if that is a situation you're dealt with, is the product or innovation teams are going to build a product, and then you are going to get told, hey, go position it for Y audience. But it almost never is a good, I would say it is never a good strategy to have either a vague group in mind when you develop a product and go try to sell it to another, or have one group A in mind and then try to go sell it to customer B, because there's just going to be misalignment. So that leads me to step 2. Assuming you're not in an organization, or kind of tactical approach to, which assuming you're not in an organization where you're in that, I would say first is look around the building and see if everyone is on the same page in terms of how we're thinking about customer segments. Because it's more common than you'd imagine, where maybe product and design have a set of personas that they developed because somebody in their agile training said that they had to have a persona so they could write a user story. And so they went and did some work independently. And then marketing maybe has some personas that they've developed. And then maybe sales doesn't think of personas, but they've sort of developed demo scripts or kind of walkthroughs based upon some qualifying questions. And if those things aren't in harmony, you kind of end up in that same situation. So kind of walking around the building and trying to figure out, okay, hey, we've got these things, but is everyone on the same page in terms of who we're talking to? And then I would say number 3, and this one is a little bit more intense, assuming that, the first 2 are not a problem. A lot of B2B marketers have suffered from inheriting this idea from B2C around using demographics, which in B2B we call firmographics, as primary segmentation criteria. And so what the root cause of this is, okay, hey, we've got a set of customer segments or personas that we've defined, but they don't actually drive decision-making within the organization or determine what customers buy. Because, the simplest example at a high level is SMB mid-market enterprise. It's like, okay, I get it. I guess it's better than having an all one size fits all approach. But, you may have an enterprise customer that is acting very much like a SMB because of their particular use case or how their organization is structured, or the other, contextual tools that the department you're selling to is using. And so that would be the third thing, is if your personas segments are purely defined on kind of firmographic basis. And just quickly what I mean by firmographics, usually some sort of size variable, whether it's employees or amount of revenue, industry vertical, department head, region. Like, yes, there can be differences between those, but they usually are not what's underlying the defining purchasing criteria or why they make certain decisions over others.
No, those are some great insights. And I had a follow-up question for you, Dan, and it kind of like lends or opens the door to talk a little bit more about market research. So that third point about the personas and not basing them on firmographics, because that could lead folks down the wrong path. What do you think that they should be doing instead? So what should they be basing this segmentation or these personas on, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's also, right, like who should be doing this in an organization, and usually this is probably something that should be driven by marketing or product, probably jointly together. It's not something that I wouldn't leave it to any other group outside those two, because it does require some intense work. So let me just start at a very high level. When we do a segmentation well, at the end, we need to know 2 things: who customers are and what they want. The problem with kind of relying on firmographics alone is we kind of stop and end at the first part, who they are. we do need that, but we also need to know what they want, because what they want determines the context and the value. Goes back to the beginning of our conversation. And so then the question is like, where do you start? And so if you are, I'll give a little bit of a contextual frame here. If you are in an organization where you have nothing, your first battle is to try to make sure that everyone understands that not all customers are the same. You do not sell the same thing to everyone. People have different needs. And so one way that you can do that is by starting with something like a firmographic segmentation, right? So if you're starting from zero, where that's your battle, I would not go off on a deep qualitative research project, because you may have a battle on your hands to even convince people that, hey, we need to think about our different customers separately. And so that's a good place to start if you have nothing, or if that's the battle you're facing. And assuming that you have at least sort of what we might call an a priori framework, right? A firmographic framework. And maybe you use something like, maybe you bought a research report from Gartner or Forrester or one of these analyst firms, right? And sort of inheriting that. Like I even think of those the same way, because when we think of a priori segmentation, we're using sort of characteristics that people have already defined, right? I can go to this CIA fact book or, the World Bank, right? And these people have data sets that are already sort of sliced and diced, worldwide, right? That I can already use. And so maybe you start there. And then I want to go and do the next level, which is in-depth customer insight gathering, right? And I'm using customer in the broad sense because some of these people are unlikely to even be your customers, but trying to figure out, okay, these are all the different market segments that we have from our a priori. Now we want to go in depth and talk to different groups of them. And this is where jobs to be done really helps us, where the idea is that we want to really understand what their context is, what they're trying to achieve, what they've tried in the past, why that doesn't work, how they ran their process, who is involved, what were the decision criteria that they used. There's some really good talks if you want a sort of masterclass on how to do this. I think it was the Business of Software conference. Bob Mesta did this live on stage for everyone, where he did a very in-depth jobs to be done level interview. And I think it was about like buying a car. And I'm going to do a very poor impression of him right now, but things that he was talking about is like framing it like you're filming a documentary. Who is there? What was going through your mind? And you're talking to the guy on stage. It's like, well, we were looking at this hatchback, but earlier in the conversation is like, oh, my wife was about to have a baby. I knew our old car wouldn't work for our growing family. And so we're at the car dealership and we had the stroller with us and we tried to put it in the back of the car and the stroller wouldn't fit. And he goes, I'm not living the rest of the 10 years I have this car with this struggle, right? Or however long the stroller was be needed for, right? That's the type of thing that you don't get out of, oh, we've got analytical data, from our Google Analytics of the people, things we're looking around their website. It's like, no, you've got a real idea there of how, like, okay, people have to be able to fit their stroller in the back, right? Because I mean, look, you can go on the website and be like, oh, the trunk dimensions are 3.7 feet by 4.8, and nobody knows what that means until you're there, living it, right? And so, but that makes a lot of sense. And then you have a whole way as a go-to-market, as a marketer, to talk to that and then build your messaging around things like that, because you really understand deeply the customer's context and why that matters to them. Because they don't need a bigger trunk in their hatchback because they're not also looking at the Ford F-150 because they're looking at haul and gravel every day, right? And so they need it to be rough and tumble. They got to put the stroller and the groceries in back, right? So knowing these deeper things only really comes from this in-depth customer conversations. And then as you do that, you have these patterns emerge, and then you can use other statistical analyses, more quantitative methods once you have those to further refine. If people want that advanced class, I'm happy to go down that road. But I've written pretty extensively on my blog about it as well.
Yeah. I would save that for those who are going to be inspired by this conversation, and then give them an excuse to reach out to you and find out more about that masterclass.
I love that.
Okay, now we're going to get to the point in the conversation where we're talking about actionable tips, and you've given us quite a bit already, but let's just say that there's somebody out there, whether it's somebody who's in the who's a B2B marketer, or maybe even somebody in the product department that's listening to this conversation, and you want them to walk away with 3 to 5 things they can take action on based on today's conversation, what would those things be?
Well, I definitely would point to those things I already talked about around customer segmentation in terms of, making sure that your executive team not all understands all buyers are alike, making sure that at least if that's the case, the departments are not misaligned on what are those descriptions of buyers and or customers. And then, if you have that all good, going on, talking to your customers, because there is no end substitute. And I was actually talking to another CEO who had come to this realization as well, because they, this is the thing. Founders know this in their bones because they had to work so hard to figure out what customers needed. It's when companies get to a certain scale and you bring in non-founders who are trying to run this process that insight gets lost. And if you're still a CEO founder running the company, potentially you may just think that everyone has the same understanding as you do, right? But even that information can get out of date and markets can change, et cetera. And so I was asking him, I was like, well, why don't people do this? Because talk to your customers is so, it's almost cliche at this point, but he's like, it's because it's uncomfortable. It's like, we like to look at our dashboards because they tell us the story we have in our minds already. And we have this confirmation bias, but we in front of a customer and they're reaming us out because the product doesn't work in their environment because of some situation. You can't avoid that. I guess we could rationalize anything else away, but know that it's going to be uncomfortable, right? So I guess that's just know that going in, but do it anyway, right? And learn to really love that feeling. When I walk out of those conversations and I'm like, man, I had a totally different view of how customers used our product, and now I have something different. Like now I love that feeling. Right. That's a good day. It was like, oh, I learned, right? So I think a reframe there is helpful as well. And then look, I would say for pricing in general, we could talk about a whole lot of techniques, et cetera. But 2 basic things. Make sure there's an owner in an organization that's explicitly defined, and then have a process. And that process does not have to be perfect from day one, but pricing and packaging is a thing. Your product is constantly evolving. Your value is evolving. Your differentiated value is definitely evolving because your competitors aren't standing still. Even if your product is the same, your competitors are moving, as some of the AI companies found out, unfortunately, this week.
Oh, yeah.
And so, okay, well, what happens? Like, all right, now we have a process to revisit it. We have a cadence, right? And someone is in charge of that. And again, one of these things that you'd be surprised how often, it's this thing that nobody owns and there's not a regular process to revisit when it's such a powerful growth lever, right? It's like we have a marketing department, right? And everyone's laser focused on MQLs and sales pipeline, right? And that's all around quantity, and that's good. And we need that. And just, you're like, wait, there's only 3 ways to grow a SaaS business: acquisition, monetization, and retention. And you guys are only looking at one of these levers most of the time. Retention comes up when we hit a recessionary period. Then everyone really cares about their existing customers, making sure they don't leave, because acquisition gets really, really hard. But I would say, yeah, having a process and paying attention to it, right? And look, it's not going to be perfect, but you'll get better over time, and those 2 things will go a long way.
Absolutely. And on the topic of retention, you don't want to ever wait until times are hard. And then you get your teams to go to the customer and say, hey, please stay, right? I mean, by that point in time, they might have already abandoned ship and gone somewhere else.
Yeah, no, I have been violent agreement with you. That is not a good strategy. But in times, especially as we saw in the 0 interest rate era, where it was kind of growth at all costs, things like retention got put on a back burner as people were trying to do a mad land grab of capabilities and growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Dan, get up on your soapbox, man. What is a status quo in your area of expertise that you passionately disagree with, and why? And I know you've got a million, but just I'm only asking for one.
It would probably be my general dislike of freemium, especially as it applies to B2B companies. I think this is something that was imported again from B2C companies where it sometimes works on the margins, but rarely is a good move, if ever, for a B2B software company. It tends to, the flames are fanned by folks who waive the exceptions when it does work around, versus really understanding that those are the exceptions and the rule is most people should should avoid it.
Yeah, I think if I'm not mistaken, you wrote about it on LinkedIn. It's definitely on your profile, and I think you wrote a post about it. And
I've written about it a lot.
Yeah. But that's a fair point, man. That's a fair point. Okay. The bonus question, and we talked about this in our previous conversation. So let me see here. In your bio, it says that you completed a solo round-the-world expedition to 21 countries. Wow, that's a handful. A lifelong dream involving several life-changing volunteering experiences and a new collection of friends and good stories. So the question is, tell us about one of your most unforgettable moments during that trip around the world and how it changed you.
The experience that I would say changed me the most was right at the beginning, which is I did while I was traveling for that year and a half, I did two 10-day meditation retreats. But the first one I would say was every single one I've done has been very, very impactful, but that has changed me tremendously. If we were talking about status quo in general that I severely disagree with, it's that we are given this incredible piece of machinery called the human mind with no instruction manual. There are ways of finding out what that really is in 10 days of silent meditation that are not available elsewhere. And the ability to clear the lens of the way you process the world, and so many different aspects. There's so many ways of being that we did not choose consciously. And I'm not one to say that this is the only way to truth, or even that there is truth at the end, but it is a way, and a very powerful way, to unwind what are probably ways that you didn't even know you were looking at the world through. Let's call it non-rose colored glasses. Because we all too often account our perception of reality with reality itself. So sorry if that got too philosophical there in the last moments.
Very profound, very profound. May I ask where you did the silent retreat or the silent meditation?
I've done several of them, and two I did while traveling. I actually did the first one here in the States, up in Dallas, and I did the second one while I was traveling down outside of Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Wow. Okay. So you've seen a bit of the world then, huh?
A little bit.
Yeah. Any tips for getting over jet lag? Just as we're wrapping up.
None. I've not conquered that as a skill set.
Yeah, that's a hard one to tackle, huh? Yeah. No, fantastic. Dan, this has been an absolute blast. I mean, thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing your expertise and experience with the listeners. So please, quick intro to yourself and how folks out there can get in touch with you.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the opportunity to share what I've learned along the way. I try to do that pretty regularly on LinkedIn, so folks can reach out to me there. Just let me know you heard on the podcast so I could separate it from the rest of the LinkedIn spam. I try to blog semi-regularly, although not as much as I'd like, on my website, producttranquility.com. You can also reach out to me there. And I also have a podcast myself called SaaS Scaling Secrets, where I interview CEOs of scale-up B2B SaaS companies about how to grow software businesses from 5, 10, 20 million and beyond.
Awesome. And we'll be sure to drop the link to the show in the show notes for this episode. All right. Once again, Dan, thank you so much for your time. Take care, stay safe, and talk to you soon.
Thank you, Christian.
All right. Bye for now.